Hi everyone, Martin Shelford here, the Shortboard Leader. This video is the second in our series looking at fluidity in business, and specifically we'll be looking at why adaptability really starts with reality. Let's get going. Now, most businesses don't really have a change problem. They have a noticing problem. We tend to think about an adaptable business as one that's capable of changing quickly, one that can restructure itself quickly, one that can change its strategy at pace or adopt new technology quickly. It can respond quickly when something happens in the market. But I've just started to think that, well, maybe that's too late, because before you can change to the right thing, something else has to happen first. You have to notice that something that you currently believe is no longer true. And that, I think, is where adaptability really begins. In the first video I did on fluidity in business, I talked about why I think we need to redefine businesses for fluidity, because the organizations that most of us work in were largely designed for a world that behaved very differently from the one that we're operating in today. And that creates an interesting problem because, well, reality is continuously moving. Customers change, technology changes, competitors change, the economy changes, social expectations change, what people want from work changes. The assumptions that were perfectly reasonable 5 years ago may not be reasonable today. And yet our organizations don't automatically update themselves for when reality changes. There's a sequence here that I think matters. Reality changes. We notice, we make a judgment about what that change means, and then we respond. But when we talk about adaptability, we tend to spend most of our time talking about the last bit. How quickly can we respond? How quickly can we execute? How quickly can we transform ourselves? How quickly can we change? But there's a problem with that, because if we haven't noticed correctly, or if we've noticed something but interpreted it through an outdated understanding of the world, well, then this becoming faster at responding doesn't necessarily make us more adaptable. It can simply make us faster at doing the wrong thing. And I think this happens far more often than we realize. One of the things that I've become increasingly interested in is how organizations become rigid in the first place, because I don't think most rigidity begins with, well, bad decisions. Quite the opposite, in fact. It often begins with good decisions. Someone might solve a problem and it works, the solution works, so we do it again. And because it keeps working, we create a process around it. Then perhaps a structure, maybe add a KPI in, maybe some sort of governance mechanism. Eventually, we stop thinking about why we did it that way in the first place. It simply becomes, well, how we do things here. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. Businesses need repeatability. They need systems. They need processes. They need structure. The problem is that while all of that is becoming embedded, or reality keeps moving, the answer stays still. The world doesn't. And eventually something that began as a perfectly rational response to reality becomes an inherited assumption about reality. Well, that's a very different thing. Imagine two lines. The first represents reality, what's actually happening outside and inside the organization. And the second represents our understanding of reality. When these two things are reasonably close together, well, we're in pretty good shape. We don't need perfect information. That's impossible. But our mental model of the world is close enough to the real world that we can make reasonably good judgments about what to do. The problem starts when these two lines begin to separate. Reality moves. Our understanding doesn't really move with it, and a gap begins to form. At first, that gap might not matter much. The business continues to perform. Customers continue to buy the products and services. The numbers still look reasonably good. So there isn't necessarily an obvious reason to question anything. However, reality keeps moving and gradually that gap gets bigger. And I think the gap is incredibly important because the danger facing an organization isn't simply that the world has changed. The world has always changed. The danger is the growing distance between what is true and what the organization believes to be true. Eventually, the gap starts to produce symptoms. Growth might slow, customers start to behave differently, margins can come under pressure, innovation gets harder, decisions take longer, people become frustrated, Those competitors we previously dismissed start to become credible. Things that used to work stop working quite as well. And at that point, organizations quite reasonably conclude, well, we need to change. And this is where things get interesting because, well, what do we reach for? We choose to restructure our organization. We set up a transformation program. We develop a new strategy. We overhaul the operating model. We insert new technology or initiate a bunch of culture initiatives. And sometimes these things are absolutely necessary. I'm not arguing against transformation. I'm not arguing against restructuring. And I'm certainly not arguing against developing new strategy. I'm arguing that those things are responses. And if we haven't understood what changed, why it has changed, which of our assumptions are no longer true, and what reality is now telling us, then we risk responding to the symptoms rather than the actual root problem. Now, an organization can be incredibly busy changing things without becoming any better at noticing what actually needs to change. And that's why I think adaptability has to start somewhere earlier. Adaptability for me starts with seeing. I've been thinking about this again after reading McKinsey's latest State of Organizations research. They've been looking at the forces reshaping organizations: technology, economic and geopolitical disruption, changing workforce expectations. And there's an observation in that research that particularly interests me. Some of the assumptions underpinning existing organizations and strategies may already have been rendered obsolete by changes in the outside world. And that gets to the heart of the problem for me. Because the question isn't simply, how quickly can we change? There's an earlier question. How quickly can we recognize that an assumption has expired? I think that's an incredibly powerful question for a leadership team, because assumptions have a habit of disappearing from view. Once we've believed something for long enough, we stop experiencing it as a belief. It just feels like reality. And that's pretty dangerous because reality has no obligation whatsoever to continue validating our assumptions. So if adaptability begins with noticing, what does a genuinely fluid business do differently? I don't think this needs another enormous framework. At its simplest, I think there are just three things. First, observe. What's actually happening? Not what we'd like to be happening, not what the strategy says should be happening, not what happened last year. What is happening now? Second, question. What are we assuming to be true about customers, about competitors, about our people, about technology, about our business model, about the market, about ourselves? And importantly, which of these assumptions are conclusions we've recently reached and which are simply things that we've inherited? Then third, update. Given what we're now seeing, what does the evidence justify? And I want to make an important distinction here. Fluidity does not mean changing your mind constantly. It doesn't mean throwing away the strategy every 6 months. It doesn't mean instability. Sometimes you look at reality, interrogate your assumptions, and conclude, nope, we still believe this is the right answer, and that's great. But now you've done something important. You've earned the right to keep that. Because the answer is no longer surviving simply because it was yesterday's answer. It's surviving because you've tested it against today's reality. This is really a question of judgment. And this is where I've started to think fluidity connects to something much deeper: judgment. Because organizations don't see reality directly. People observe things. Customers tell us things. Data informs us about things. People at the edge of organization notice things, and that information travels across the business. Some of it gets amplified, some gets filtered out, someone interprets it, existing assumptions influence that interpretation. Hierarchy influences it, incentives influence it, fear influences it, experience influences it. Eventually, all of that becomes a judgment, and then the institution acts. So perhaps building a fluid business isn't primarily about becoming better at change. Perhaps it's about becoming better at discovering what is true, and then creating the conditions under which good judgment can form around what we've discovered. Because once you see reality clearly, change becomes a different problem. So I've actually changed how I think about adaptability. I used to think the most adaptable organizations were the ones capable of changing fastest. I'm no longer sure that's correct. I think the most adaptable organizations might simply be the ones that's hardest to fool about what's actually happening in reality, one that notices when reality moves, one that is willing to question what it previously believed, and one that's capable of updating its judgment before that gap becomes a crisis. Maybe that's where fluidity really begins, not with change, but with seeing. And that's what I'm going to explore further in our next video. Check it out soon.